So is that okay? Does that look okay? Let's hope it does. Thank you, Jenny. So, okay. So then, this is the third lecture in our series. It was scheduled to be the second, but now it is the third. The title is Towards Unification of Cognitive Science and Affective Neuroscience. And it is part of a more general series, Cognitive Science in the Age of AGI. The original plan was to have 4 lectures, one of which was on types of computation. But because we spent basically 2 days rather than just one dealing with the first topic here, now we have something has to give, and I have decided that types of computation are the least important. So we have started to talk about affective science last time, and I will just pick up where we started. But before I do that, I think it would be useful to take stock of where we were and what the main take-home messages of the first 2 classes were. So we started by saying that their artificial intelligence is getting better and better, and general artificial intelligence is projected to be implemented very soon, within a decade, let's say, and that this raises some important questions about alignment. And then alignment, that is, will these artificial intelligences be friendly or not? This so-called alignment problem. Hi, Kalina, thank you for showing up. So this alignment problem is about alignment of values, and so you have to talk about values and motivation, and the moment you talk about that, you discover very quickly that you cannot discuss motivations and values without talking about emotion. And so because I worry about AGI alignment quite a bit recently, I'm driven to the study of emotions, and when I started reading about them, I figured it turned out it is a fascinating topic. They play an absolutely foundational role in the mind. So this is one key point. Emotions are important. Throughout our lecture, we follow the maxim that nothing in biology makes sense unless considered in the light of evolution. And neuroscience is part of biology, so we have to, everything is like the big theoretical framework is that of evolutionary theory. And the starting point for our considerations is that organisms, and maybe artificial organisms one day in the not too distant futures, but certainly biological organisms are autonomous agents in an ecological niche. And then we spent maybe 45 minutes going over the development of robotics, emphasizing mobile robots because these are autonomous. And it turned out from functional considerations, engineers who build robots found themselves that they must adopt the so-called layered architecture for robot control. It is not one big kind of single architecture, but it has to be separated in these different layers, and we discussed what these layers are. I'm not going to repeat that here. And then we moved over to the neuroscience realm and considered the neuroanatomy of the mammalian brain and a series of neuropsychological studies involving animals that have various portions of their brains removed, and then observing what kinds of behaviors are spared after different levels of damage to the nervous system. And the take-home message was that the mammalian brain also seems to have a layered organization. And this is a schematic here of a rat brain. And so there are these different levels, like the brainstem is at the bottom, and then on top of it, you have midbrain, and then diencephalon, and then the end brain at the top. And then we also talked about these self-stimulation studies with rats, and it reported some fascinating data about if an electrode is included along this pathway here, the so-called reward pathway of the brain, at different stages. Throughout that, actually, many of these sites have the property that if a rat is given an opportunity to press a pedal to deliver a pulse of electricity or stimulate some of these areas, quite often the rats go crazy and self-stimulate like in a very addictive fashion. And we will talk some more about this in the beginning of today's lecture. And then based on these kinds of considerations, once that we reach the conclusion that the mammalian brain has this layered organization, then the question arose about the so-called selection problem. If there are these multiple levels and there are cases in which they want to promote different behaviors, some kind of circuit must take decision in the end which of the many possible actions to perform and actually commit to and move the body accordingly. And the basal ganglia are very well established for being a selection circuit like that. And as a matter of fact, this is the what we term the highest motor path, the final motor path. It turns out the final decision maker in the brain is not in the neocortex at the top, but in the subcortex in the basal ganglia. And then there were also these suggestive hypotheses, very not as well established, but somewhere early in the brainstem, there may be another secondary, or I should say more ancient. Maybe that is the first and the basal ganglia are the second. But at any rate, the so-called medial reticular formation in the brainstem is also a circuit that can kind of take winner takes all decision among competing alternatives. And then last but not least, this is like the beginning of a lecture on emotions proper, on affective neuroscience. The main approach would be experiments with animals, or at least we started with these wire-headed rats that were pressing buttons to stimulate their brains. And one big advantage in working with animals is that you can do these causal experiments. You can actually manipulate things. You can take away, make lesions, permanent lesions or reversible lesions. You can stimulate parts of the brain directly. And modern neuroscience has these powerful optogenetic methods that we didn't talk about. But so the moment you start working with animals, the instruments at your disposal increase maybe by a factor of 10. Compared to human neuroscience with neuroimaging, which is mostly correlational. Okay, and so this is how far we were able to get. And now, as I was making this recapitulation, I realized I've missed out one very important and interesting piece of evidence. So let me kind of add it to the picture, and then we get to the plan for today. So once again, these are very old data dating back to the 1950s. You have all seen these pictures in psychology textbooks. These are the famous homunculi by Wilder Penfield, the neurosurgeon who 75 years ago was performing with his colleagues neurosurgeries on awake patients. And you may think, what kind of barbaric procedure is that? It was actually done in good faith as a treatment to intractable epilepsy. So there were these unfortunate individuals who have these repeated seizures and so forth. And in the 1950s, the pharmacological options were a lot more limited than they are today. And so as a matter of last resort, sometimes neurosurgical operations were performed and some parts of the brain were kind of cut away because they were epileptogenic. That is, they were places where epileptic seizures started. And Penfield obviously didn't want to cut out more tissue than absolutely necessary, and he wanted to kind of leave very important pieces of tissue. And this is why these surgeries were performed under local anesthesia only. So the patients were conscious and they could talk. There are no pain receptors inside the skull, as you know. And so these patients didn't feel any pain, and they could tell the surgeon how they felt when different patches of their cortex were stimulated electrically. And so, as I said, the famous Penfield homunculi are based on these data, and everybody has seen those. But what is less commonly known is the following amazing fact. So remarkably, the removal of sizable sectors of cortex, and by sizable I mean like 1/4 of the cortical surface. So here in this figure, which is based on drawings from Penfield and Jasper from the 1950s. So there are these 3 different patients overlain on one figure, but it's not that one patient got cut in these 3 different ways. These are just 3 different patients in one figure. But as you can see, massive parts of cortex were sometimes taken out. Actually, sometimes even as radical as hemispherectomy, which is just removal of the cortex of one entire hemisphere. And so the remarkable fact is that these massive surgical excisions, that is cutting off of cortex, did not interrupt the continuity of consciousness. So imagine you're there being conscious, let's say 1/3 of your cortex is taken out, and as it is being removed from your brain, you remain conscious and you keep talking. And on the basis of these data, Penfield advanced what he called the so-called centrancephalic hypothesis. So something in the center of the encephalon. Encephalon is the brain. The center of the brain is the subcortical core. And so he talks about, so the hypothesis as Penfield formulated it is that the highest integrative function of the brain are not completed at the cortical level, but in an upper brainstem system of central convergence, supplying the key mechanism of consciousness. So it is the subcortex that controls sleep and wakefulness, and the basal ganglia, which are also subcortical, are the final decision maker. Of course, they are bidirectionally connected with the prefrontal cortex and the executive network in cortex and so forth. But one take-home message that we kept emphasizing is that we should not neglect the contributions of the subcortical structures. And way too many neuroimagers only focus on cortex because the subcortical structures are kind of hard to see on their scanners. So they may be missing the most important part of the brain. One analogy that I gave is like the subcortex is like the operating system of a computer, whereas the cortex are the application programs. And yes, the application programs are like 99% of the code, but the operating system, even though it is 1% of the code, if you measure just how many bytes in memory it occupies, if you damage the operating system, the computer crashes. Whereas if you damage some of the applications, just this one application stops running. And so we can have patients with focal lesions to their cortex and they become agnosic or aphasic and so forth and so on. Okay, so then this was a kind of setting of the stage and summary for today's lecture. So, and it is about affective neuroscience. Here's the plan. I will give a few examples of emotional episodes just so we kind of have some specific cases to think about. And then I will talk about certain theoretical issues. Then we'll discuss the relationship between cognitive science on one hand and affective science on the other. And finally, there is this section with the ambitious title, Putting It All Together. And I actually think I do have a fighting chance of going through all of this today. So let's get on with it. This is just to refresh your memory. Last time at the end of class, we spent maybe 15 minutes talking about these implanted electrodes and this self-stimulation data with rats. I already talked about this figure. Now, these sites that when given an opportunity, rats will self-stimulate. In other words, it feels good, or at least we think rats feel good when this part of the brain is stimulated. They track these neuromodulatory systems in the brain, and there are 4 of them. The dopaminergic system is very important, and there's clearly involved in reward and reinforcement learning, but there are 3 other neuromodulatory systems. We commented on the fact that they all have the same basic organization. Namely, the sources of these neuromodulatory chemicals are located in nuclei in the brainstem, and then they're projected to the rest of the brain. And so in that sense also, the brainstem is like the core that drives and heavily influences what goes on in the rest of the brain. And there are these fascinating data about deep brain stimulation in human patients, with all the caveats associated with the fact that all of them tend to be inserting needles into somebody's brain is not done lightly. So they all had some kind of intractable epilepsy or schizophrenia or narcolepsy or some other very serious and treatment resistant condition before the surgery. But at any rate, their brains are human brains, and it is important data. And now this is where this slide is something that we have not talked about. This is the point where I ran out of time last time. And so let me tell you about a very important emotion, which is about attachment between a child and its mother. So a lot of emotions have a very important social role in mammals anyway. So mammals take care of their young, and they are these emotional circuits that provide a bond between the caregiver and young infants. Young mammalian infants are very helpless creatures. They need attention 24/7 and dedicated. There is data, I will mention that, or at least a major hypothesis out there in the affective neuroscience literature is that a dedicated system in mammalian infants exists so that the child makes sure to stay close to the mother. And then another complementary system exists in the adults, both male and female, but especially in female adults, to take care of these helpless little babies. So there are these fascinating studies by Harry Harlow. I'm sure many of you have seen this picture before, but there are these fascinating videos to go with it. And let me play you some of those. Before I do, while I'm setting it up here, also another thing that's important to note when you study emotion in animals is that unlike people, animals don't conceal their emotions. They don't have this big cortex. They still have cortex, of course, but not as big as humans. And they don't have this notion that you're supposed to control yourself or whatever. So when a little baby monkey is scared, it just runs away and it wears its emotions on the sleeve. And so when you observe animals in these very powerful situations, it is absolutely obvious they feel these profound emotions. And so we have examples of that. Let's see if that will work. So this is Harry Harlow, who has a kind of diabolical mind. I don't want to be a subject in his lab. He was kind of a nasty guy, in my opinion. But I'm not sure these experiments can pass IRB review today, but they were done in the 1950s, and the knowledge that was extracted out of these poor monkeys is very valuable. So,
a monkey raised on a nursing wire mother.
Jenny, right?
Now here are 106's two mothers. As you can see, it was weaned on a wire mother. Here's baby 106. Watch.
He's going to the wire mother.
He's got to eat to live.
Oh, he's going back.
He's back on the cloth mother, and he'll stay on the cloth mother. Actually, this baby spends from 17 to 18 hours a day on the cloth mother and less than 1 hour a day on the wire mother. We had predicted that the variable of contact comfort would be a variable of measurable importance, but we were unprepared to find that it completely overwhelmed and overshadowed all other variables, including those of nursing.
So just to interject here, to connect it to the way I talked about this, there is this dedicated instinctual system that the infant just knows to cling on to the mother as much as possible. So even if there is this other thing that gives milk, it is important to feel the kind of fur and warmth of the body of the mother. And now here's the really diabolical part. So let's keep.
Of its mother.
Uh-oh.
Now, in this experiment, this is the apparatus we use.
That looks diabolical.
That's just the way the baby monkey feels about it. Flashing eyes, loud sound, moving mechanical parts, all of these things are designed to frighten a monkey. Now here we have a peaceful, resting baby monkey. Let's find out what his reactions to his mother are when we frighten him.
He's scared, all right.
And he does what any child will do in a similar situation.
He runs away.
It's more than running away. He was running to his mother, to touch her, to drive away his fear. Contact with the mother changes his entire personality. Look, now he's actually threatening the diabolical object. All right. This gives us part of the picture of the strength of infantile love.
And now
This is a
there is
6-foot square room
anxiety
with a few
study.
toys and other objects. But to the monkey, it's much more menacing. We know that when our own children are taken to a strange place without their mothers, they are often overwhelmed with fear. This room is just such a new and strange environment for the baby monkeys. No mother is in there. Now, let's put a monkey into the room. Notice how cautiously he enters the room. He's searching for comfort, but nothing relieves his disturbance. Now we'll take the baby monkey out and put in a wire mother.
Now, this one was nursed by a wire mother.
That's right, all his life.
She doesn't seem to help much.
Now, we'll try the same test with a cloth mother in the room. You see the contrast in the behavior? Despite the fact that the wire mother nursed him, she could offer this infant nothing in the way of affection or security. But here the monkey, by rubbing against the cloth mother, as if he were seeking as much contact comfort as he could get, builds up his reservoir of affection and security. First, his body relaxes as the fear disappears. But above and beyond this, new positive response patterns appear. He now goes out to explore and investigate this new, strange world. He is now a normal, happy, curious baby.
Okay. So this is an example of emotions at their primal level in an evolutionary context. So this is what this particular part of the system was designed to do. So the baby kind of sticks to the mother, and as I said, the mother takes care of the baby and so forth. So that's another a very prominent kind of example to think about when we talk about emotions. And it exists in human, not the same system. There is another system, fear, that is not just for mammals, but all animals, basically, all the way down to pleasure, have some kind of defensive circuits, and fear is part of the defense circuit. Now I realize I haven't prepared this, so let me just set it up real quick here. But there are these, one specific special case is fear of snakes, and the example here on the screen is about this
Pesty is a subscription-based service with a bug-free guarantee. You simply fill the bag of water,
artificial
mix
snake
in
that is on the sidewalk. So let me show you. I need to switch now, switch gears to this other window. So these are human beings minding their own business, walking down like normal, like a day like any other. And then there is this unexpected surprise. And so this is like, I don't know, 8 minutes, maybe 100 people go by, at least 1/3 of them react by running away, and then 89%, 90% of them then start laughing and realizing, oh, it's a joke, it's not actually a snake. Then their behavior changes. But the first kind of, in the first half a second, the response is just run away. And the speculation is that a lot of mammalian infants were eaten by snakes throughout the evolutionary history, and so we are kind of not friends with them, and the biggest villain in the Bible is a snake, and so forth and so on. So that's another example of a kind of emotional reaction to things. Now I have some experimental data. I have 2 more examples. This is about an experiment. It's notable with that that it is about non-conscious affective processing. So it is, as I said, a psychological experiment in the laboratory. It involved 3 groups of participants based on self-reports. There were those who were afraid of snakes, but not spiders. Another group of participants were afraid of spiders, but not snakes. And then there were control participants that didn't report any, neither spider, they feared neither spiders nor snakes. And so these are the 3 groups of bars here. These are the snake fearful people. This is the spider fearful people. And this is the control fearful. I assume you see my mouse. And then there were 4 kinds of stimuli: stimuli of snakes, stimuli of spiders, and 2 controlled kinds of stimuli, flowers and mushrooms. And the vertical axis here plots a physiological measure, skin conductance response, which is this measure of the parasympathetic system, kind of when a lot of emotions, actually all emotions, have these physiological effects, among others. And so the heartbeat rises, and palms become sweaty, and the skin conducts more electricity. So higher numbers here mean more sweaty palms, more kind of agitated body. And as you can see, so this is like in a control session, when the stimulus is put up on the screen for as long as for a long enough time so that the participants can see it clearly. The snake fearful people show a reaction to snakes, but not the other stimuli. The spider fearful people show a reaction to the spiders, but not the other stimuli. And the control people don't show a reaction to anything. So this is just to make sure that the groups are as advertised. Now, the interesting thing is what happens when you present the visual stimulus very briefly. I don't remember exactly how briefly, but something on the order of 50, 60 milliseconds, and then block it with a mask, so that consciously people say, I didn't see anything. There was just a flash. I couldn't make out what was going on. But if you measure their galvanic skin response, it basically looks indistinguishable from that in the full conscious condition. So it doesn't matter if you are afraid of snakes and you're shown a snake so that you can clearly see it, or you're shown a snake for 50 milliseconds and then the snake is masked. Some part of the brain reacts to it even before the cortex kind of catches wind of what's going on. And there is this prominent researcher in affective neuroscience. His name is Joseph Ledoux. He talks about the low road and the high road of fear. The low road is subcortical. The high road goes through cortex and is conscious, but goes slower. And so if we go back to this example here, some people kind of withdraw from the snake, and that's like the low road kicking in, and then the high road says, oh no, actually it's just a toy, it's not poisonous, don't worry about it. And then people start laughing and all of that. Okay, and my final example is a famous social psychology study. We will need it as a kind of this is the kind of data that the so-called social constructivists appeal to. As we'll see, one theoretical controversy is whether, to what extent emotions are kind of biologically given, hardwired, instinctual things versus social constructions. And so social constructivists really like to point out this study. It is another famous study. I'm sure many of you are already familiar with it. There was this, it was done in Canada, in a national park in Canada, where there's this very rickety, long suspension bridge. It's a kind of scary bridge. And as people who walk across the bridge and the wind blows and the bridge shakes under their feet, and if you measure galvanic skin response and other measures of physiological arousal, the bridge has an arousing effect. Like it kind of rattles up your sympathetic nervous system. And so there was a bridge like that, and another very sturdy concrete bridge, not scary at all. And in experiment 1, data were collected. There were a male experimenter or a female interviewer. So people were interviewed, and half of them were interviewed by an attractive female interviewer and the other half by male interviewer. And then half of them were kind of stopped immediately after they have crossed the suspension bridge, the scary bridge, and the other half when they had crossed the sturdy bridge. And the task was to comment on this ambiguous image. It is taken from the so-called thematic apperception test, or TAT. It is a projective test, and so forth and so on. So there was some kind of task given to them that was designed not to have anything to do with sexual arousal or anything like that. And then at the end of it, the interviewer said, and by the way, if you have something more to say, here's my phone number, feel free to call me. And the dependent variable was the proportion of people who would actually follow up with a phone call. And the main result was that there were significantly more phone calls in the high arousal than the low arousal conditions. In experiment 1, the high arousal was the suspension bridge. Another second experiment was conducted. There was only the suspension bridge, but people were stopped and interviewed either immediately afterwards or 10 minutes after they have crossed. Because for certain methodological reasons, the experiment 1 had these confounding interpretations. But at any rate, high arousal condition, people call up this attractive female interviewer more than a baseline. And by the way, no differences between the two conditions were observed when the interviewer was male. And I don't remember if I mentioned, but it's important, all participants were male. And the standard interpretation of that is that physiological arousal can be misinterpreted as sexual attraction. So you are aroused by the bridge, but then you talk to this attractive young woman and you kind of think, oh, gee, I really like her, and you kind of put the wrong label on the arousal. I always had a kind of second thoughts about this, but who am I to judge? But in my experience, talking to an attractive female by itself produces arousal. And so it is not that somehow the arousal was generated only by the bridge without admixtures, and the rest is just purely top-down cognitive appraisal of this arousal. The arousal was generated in two different ways in these high arousal conditions. And anyway, so it's not the point to delve into the nooks and crannies of this particular experiment, but now we have some kind of database to work with, a series of emotional phenomena. And now let's get into the theory behind it. One thing is absolutely clear. Everybody agrees on this, and this is the reason I'm spending the time to talk about it today, and to read about it during the last few months. Emotions are not just about what is, but also about what matters. So, for example, here, you walk down the street minding your own business, and then there is this snake, and it demands attention. You cannot ignore it. You cannot say, I don't care about snakes today. Today is not my snake day. It just kind of takes over. Whatever else you're doing, you drop everything, pay attention to the snake. Snakes are important. So that is not just what is, but also about what matters. And emotions don't just shape how we interpret the world, but also shape which aspects of the world need our attention and which can safely be ignored. So they're very closely related to agenda setting and motivation and so forth. And then when I started thinking about emotions, I went out and did some literature research. I started systematically going to journals such as Annual Review of Psychology and Annual Review of Neuroscience, and journals with titles like this, Trends in Cognitive Science, and search for keywords like emotion, affect, and so forth. And there were lots and lots of reviews, at least a dozen. And I flipped through all of them, and they were all over the place. So the state of play in emotion science is even worse than that in cognitive science. There are the blind man and the elephant going on big time. Emotion researchers themselves quip that there are as many theories of emotion as there are emotion theorists. And there seem to be there have a lot of effort has been invested in the theoretical enterprise of trying to define emotion. There are at least a dozen different definitions. Some very high-profile debates have been about how do you define emotion and what it is, and does it. So there are a whole lot of definitions. There is even a paper doing a kind of meta-analysis of the different definitions of emotions, searching for common ground. And so one thing that there's a lot of debate in that field, but one thing that most emotion theorists seem to agree on is that affective science is distinct from cognitive science. And I have here one of the bullets here is about emotion and cognition, and there are now two sciences, and affective scientists sometimes, quite often, talk about cognition as some kind of different tribe, and there is this competition between the two research communities. And affective scientists often use, I was amazed to see that they use the term cognition to refer to a mere part of a much bigger picture. So they would say an emotional episode has physiological arousal, facial expressions, inner feelings, and cognitions. So you have these thoughts having to do with the emotion that you think about the snake, but this is just one of the 5 things that happen. And so we should keep in mind that the term cognition is used in 2 different meanings by the 2 communities. In affective science, cognition has this narrow meaning, which is exemplified by this experiment, so cognitive appraisal. So something happened, there was arousal. Arousal is not cognition. And then on top of that, cognition comes and tells a story about the arousal. So this is the one view of the one narrow interpretation of the term cognition. And that contrasts with my own kind of attitude. In cognitive science, cognition is a very broad term. Everything is cognition. All of these things I told you about, they are part and parcel of cognitive science. So many, I should have made some kind of survey. I show you all of these emotional phenomena, all the self-stimulation studies with patients and with rats and all of that. And I would ask you, is that part of cognitive science? Is it cognitive? And I'm sure most of you would say yes. And so from one point of view, emotions are part of the mind, and cognitive science studies the mind. And so emotions are just within the umbrella. But inside affective science, they say, no, no, no. Yes, it is part of the mind, but cognition is another part of the mind. And so don't, you're kind of imperialist. You want to take over everything. And we resist that. So we'll talk more about this when I get down into the further down into my talk. But one notable thing that I want to point out is there is this so-called consensus article signed by 60 prominent affective scientists, published 3 years ago. The title is The Rise of Affectivism. And there is this kind of, let me read you the quotation. Scientific study is beset by questions of terminology. They spend a lot of time saying, yes, we know that we cannot agree on the definition. We don't have a common agreed upon definition of what we actually study. We all study emotions, but each of us has a different definition, what that word refers to. But scientific study is often beset by questions of terminology. Persistent difficulties in formally defining cognition did not prevent the transition from behaviorism to cognitivism. And the fact that there is no consensus concerning a formal definition of other important constructs such as intelligence, religion, culture, and even life does not preclude fruitful scientific study of them. And in the end, they appeal like, there was an age of cognitivism and now the age of affectivism. is upon us. So join us and don't do this cognitive stuff, study emotions instead. Now, among these cacophony of voices, I had to make a choice, and given my predilection that nothing makes sense unless considered in the light of evolution, I naturally gravitated towards these affective neuroscience, mostly driven by studies with animals and electrodes in the brain and neuromodulators and dopamine and all of that. And one author in particular, Jack Panksepp, really kind of sounded right to me. Now, I'm no expert in any of this, so my opinion doesn't really count. But as for my money, these are some of the most interesting sources. Jack Panksepp is a very prominent neuroscientist. Unfortunately, he passed away about 10 years ago, but he has received numerous awards. There are special issues in high-profile journals dedicated to his life and work. And this book, Affective Neuroscience, it was heralded. It came out in 1998, and it was heralded as a kind of magnum opus landmark contribution. And then this is his most recent book, published only a year or two before his death, The Archaeology of Mind. And I like the title because it suggests there are these layers. And as you dig deeper, like in an archaeological site, you get down to the ancient structures buried under these later accretions. And then the to-go textbook now is The Neuroscience of Emotion by Adolphs and Anderson. And the book is dedicated to Jack Panksepp, and they say, yeah, we disagree with Jack on many fronts, but he was definitely on the right track. So be advised that what I'm going to tell you is not some kind of consensus opinion inside the affective science. No such thing exists, but it is one prominent strand among several strands. And from Adolphs and Anderson, in the early chapters, they say, remember, they are painfully aware that they should refrain from defining emotion. So what they do instead is they give a list of properties of emotion states. And so property number one, called scalability, these emotion states can be more or less intensive. And a word commonly associated with that is arousal. So you can be more aroused or less aroused, although they're careful to point out, Adolphs and Anderson are, that scalability is conceptually distinct than arousal. Arousal is a more physiological concept. There are these arousal systems in the brain where scalability is a theoretical construct. The second one is valence. Pleasant, unpleasant, good and bad, reinforcing, punishing, appetitive behavior, aversive behavior. These are all kind of binary oppositions that are related to this concept of valence. The third one is very important, persistence. And that is an emotional state can persist after the stimulus that triggered it went away. So you see the snake, you startle, and the snake runs back into the grass, or somebody kills the snake or whatever. The snake is no more. You're still afraid. So that's persistence. And it can, if it gets out of hand, people get PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and so forth. Now, in post-traumatic stress disorder, unless there is a mistake, emotional episode is meant to be a kind of punctate event lasting a few minutes. And longer duration things are called moods. And so you can be in a kind of uneasy mood for days on end. And in PTSD, you have this background kind of fearful mood, and it could be punctuated by these episodes of kind of flashbacks to the scary event. But at any rate, persistence is one of the properties of emotion. Another one is generalization. So if you're afraid of real snakes, you're also afraid of plastic snakes, and you may get startled by the hose in the garden. And so different stimuli can trigger the same emotional state. And conversely, on the motor output, fear can manifest itself in different behaviors. For example, you can freeze or you can run away. Both are manifestations of fear. And there are these very interesting phenomena that at low arousal levels, animals freeze, and at higher arousal level, they run, and things like that. So these different features interact in interesting ways. Going down the list, the next item is global coordination. So the entire body is engaged. When emotion overcomes us, the body, the face, the sympathetic nervous system, the hormones in our blood, everything is kind of mobilized in the service of this singular event. So global coordination across all parts of the organism. Automaticity, they're hard to suppress. So sometimes we do our best to hide our emotions. There are these social contexts when it will be inappropriate to laugh, or inappropriate to look down the breast of somebody you're talking to or whatever. But it kind of bubbles up from underneath, whether you want it or not, and then you may be able to suppress it or not. But so there is this automatic quality, and then social communication. Emotions are in species that live in groups, such as all primates, human included, interact with it. Conspecifics is super important, and emotion play this signaling role, and facial expressions in particular are very important signals that we emit to other people and so forth. So this is the list. These 7 things are what is in the book. So if you open the book, this is the list of 7 properties. And what is conspicuous by its absence is what most lay people will say is the very important feature of emotion, namely conscious feelings. So there is something it is like to be afraid, but Adolphs and Anderson say, well, we know about feelings. Of course, they're part of the package, but let's not study. They're very hard to study scientifically, so we will bracket them out for research purposes. Part of the difficulty in defining emotion is because people couldn't agree what to do with these conscious feeling aspects of emotion. And that leads us head on into the hard problem of consciousness. As I said, there is something it is like to be afraid, and it is qualitatively different from what it is like to be euphoric or ashamed or horny or loving or angry or anxious. They have these different feels to them. And such subjective conscious experiences of emotion are often referred to as feelings or affect. And so one common kind of pattern is emotion episode, and it has feelings and cognitions among one of 5. So one of the list of 5 is feeling, another one will be cognition. You can see how this goes. The problem with the feelings and any kind of subjective experiences more generally is that they are notoriously hard to study scientifically. And in their book, Adolphs and Anderson take the stance, we don't deny feelings exist and we don't deny they are important, but at this stage of our science, maybe we should refrain from including them in the scientific discourse because it just muddies the water. And I was intrigued when I came across this because it is the converse of what a very prominent phenomenological philosopher, Edmund Husserl, as some of you may know, there is this branch of philosophy which deals with the subjective experiences. It's called phenomenology. Edmund Husserl is one of their key figures. And when you do that, when you're kind of inside the mind, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, then you run into problems of solipsism. How do you know that the external world exists? That's the other part of the mind-body problem. If you're inside the world, how do you get to the subjective experiences part? If you are inside the mind and you already have subjective experiences, how do you get out to the world? And so Edmund Husserl talks about what he says, his term is epoche, which is bracketing out the external world. He says, let's not worry whether a world exists. Of course it does, but when you do phenomenology, you don't worry about the world. You worry about how it is like on the inside. And now Adolphs and Anderson say, when we study emotions, let's bracket out the subjective feeling part of it. Now, for what is worth, I disagree with that. I don't think just hiding away from the problem will move it any closer to solving it. I think a healthier attitude is to acknowledge, yes, subjective experience is absolutely a part of the picture. It is very important. We don't know what to do with it yet, but we shouldn't just pretend it doesn't exist. We should just talk about it in the hope of making some progress. And so then, just to provide some kind of theoretical cohesiveness to this, this is the central figure, a very important diagram from the textbook. Emotions are functional states of the organism. There is this central emotional state, according to Adolphs and Anderson. Again, other authors have different schemes, but there is a common pattern that emotion, because it has this global coherence, engages the whole organism, there is some kind of central emotional state, and then it manifests itself in these 5 different ways. So observed behavior, subjective reports are fine, the subjective feelings are bracketed out, but verb talking about what you felt is fair game. Psychophysiology, things like galvanic skin response and heart rate and blood pressure. Cognitive changes, just 1 out of 5 items on the list. So cognitive changes will be things like enhanced memory or disrupted memory or better learning or poorer learning, things like that. And then somatic responses, these have to do with the visceral organs of the body. So when you get ulcers because of chronic stress, that would be a somatic response. And now, observed behavior, as you move your skeletal musculature, your body moves, and that changes things in the world. And as you release hormones into the bloodstream, your internal milieu changes, and that can also lead to observable changes. And so these feedback, and so there's some stimuli that started the whole thing. It's context modulated, and then there is some volitional control. You may try to suppress your emotions, and sometimes you succeed, sometimes you don't, but it is part of the picture. So this is a verbatim replica of figure 2.2 in the textbook, an authoritative textbook that I'm using. Now I will make 2 friendly amendments. Now take them from what it's worth. They are not coming from authority in affective science. I'm just a random guy. So one thing that I didn't like in this figure is that if you look at it, the source of all arrows, if you find like the first cause, the first mover, it is always some stimulus or other. And so that makes, in my opinion, emotion kind of reacting to external stimulation. And I think another box is necessary. Internal dynamics. Biological organisms are active creatures, and quite often they just behave even if there is no external stimulus at all. And yesterday in her lecture, Kalina mentioned these sensory deprivation tanks. When big efforts are made to minimize external stimulation as much as possible, and internally people generate all kinds of things, and a lot of these are highly emotionally charged. Also, we all know the experience kind of lying in bed in the middle of the night and waking up covered in sweat because we had a bad dream or something. That is kind of an emotional episode generated from within, not from without. And so internal dynamics of the nervous system, it has some kind of internal activity of its own endogenously. So this is one thing that I would want to add to the diagram. And the other, in light of what I just talked about with respect to subjective feelings, they are here, and they are in the diagram, not attached to anything, kind of nebulous. I don't know how to deal with them. They obviously have something to do with subjective reports, for example, but they're part of it, and let's keep talking to figure out how exactly they fit into the picture. Okay, then another generalization about the state of play in emotion science is that there are these two big competing classes of theories. On the one hand, there are the so-called dimensional theories of emotion. These tend to describe emotions, or the claim is that emotions differ not in kind, but in degree along one or more dimensions. We'll see an example coming up very shortly. So those kinds of theories are favored by social psychologists and social constructivists, and this kind of a top-down view of emotion. If you begin your study by analyzing human languages, or by asking people to generate emotion words and then doing multidimensional scaling or factor analysis of that, and you get these multidimensional scaling solutions and different words arrange themselves in this multidimensional space, this is where these dimensional kinds of theories were first formulated. Now that I talk about it, I actually may show you the simplest and most popular dimensional model has just two dimensions. The original formulation was by Russell, 1980. And so the dimensions are valence, unpleasant to pleasant, the horizontal axis here. And the second dimension is arousal. So inactive to active, and things arrange themselves around this two-dimensional plane. And so you have things like relaxed, which is pleasant but not very active. And on the other side, you have stressed, which is active and unpleasant, and sad and contented, happy, and so forth. As I said, the circumplex model was developed from factor analysis of data from self-reports. So one kind of models, one class of theory is in multidimensional spaces like this. The other major class is driven by people who study animals, and they say there are these instinctual behaviors, a relatively small number of them, and they're driven by certain circuits in the brain. They're associated with the so-called basic emotions. There is about half a dozen of them. Different theoreticians propose a different number. Sometimes it's like 5 and sometimes it's like 8, but it is like 7 plus or minus 2 basic emotions. And then there are like the atoms of emotional life. And then out of these atoms, you can make molecules, and you can make these complex emotions, which are combinations. And for example, you can talk about shame and guilt and pride. These are not basic, but they're combinations of basic ingredients. And affective scientists have been debating this for decades. It is correlated with the nature-nurture controversy and all of that. So as you can imagine, they still debate it, and there is no end in sight. I gave you an example of this dimensional model. Now, a modern incarnation of that is known as the psychological constructionist approach. This figure is taken from one recent paper in this research tradition. And one particular theory within that class is known as the theory of constructed emotion. According to this theory, emotions are created via the combination of more basic psychological and corresponding neural phenomena that are not specific to emotion. So it's not that fear has some dedicated fear circuit in the brainstem. Rather, fear is just a concept, and you build it in the same way that you build the concept of chair, using general mechanisms. So according to the theory of constructed emotion, discrete emotions are not mechanisms that each have their own unique biological underpinnings, but instead are collections of mental representations that are created from domain general processes in the brain and the body. Now, one thing that is important about emotional concepts is that the state of the body is an important part of the whole picture. And so you kind of observe your own body, and if you notice heartbeat and sweaty palms in a given situation, you say, oh, gee, I think I'm afraid now, like the cognitive appraisal story. So you feel arousal, and then you interpret arousal and then put it a label and then put it inside a kind of cluster of other instances of this emotion, and over multiple experiences you build a kind of conceptual space that includes these emotional terms as part of the overall category structure in your mind. So this is the psychological constructionist approach. And obviously, if you live in different environments, in different cultures, you would end up with different concepts of fear. And so they argue, the theoreticians in this tradition, to be afraid in England, let's say, is not the same as being afraid in Japan, because if you were raised in Japan, the Japanese culture kind of modulates the whole picture here in a different way compared to the British culture. Okay, this is my final example of this. I just want to inform you that they exist out there. My preferences go to this other tradition, the basic emotion tradition. And one prominent pioneer was Ekman, based on analysis of facial expressions. By the way, it goes all the way back to Charles Darwin himself, who published a book about emotional life of animals, and he said there are these emotional expressions on the face. So Ekman defines the 6 basic emotions: happiness, anger, surprise, sadness, disgust, and fear. And the main theoretical claims is, number 1, they're separate, discrete, and second, each one of them serves as distinctive evolutionary function, and it's hardwired to occur. Now, my a different theory, and the one I would advocate, and the one that I read about the most, is by Jack Panksepp, as I mentioned before. So Panksepp says there's 7, not 6. There's big overlap, but some kind of subtle differences. 4 fundamental emotional systems appear shortly after birth in mammals. Seeking, which is interest in curiosity and kind of go out and explore and find things about the world and kind of move. Don't just sit in a corner doing nothing. That's the seeking system. And according to Panksepp, this is like the most fundamental first, the beginning of everything else. The animal had to have some kind of internal source of activity and motivation, and that's the seeking system, and it is very closely associated with rewards. And when you self-stimulate, you're hijacking the seeking system and so forth. So that's one of the 7. Second, you have fear, which is about defending the body, running away from scary things. So the evolutionary relevance to this is obvious. Then you have rage and anger, which is about competition with other animals for food, for mates, for all kinds of things, for territory. And then panic is when separated from the caregiver. These poor monkey infants that will run out and cling to the cloth mother, and they have separation anxiety when separated from the mother. It is the panic system kicking in, and the presumed evolutionary function and ecological role is making sure the infant never gets far away from the mother, because the infant cannot survive without the mother. So these 4 appear shortly after birth, and then 3 others come later in mammalian development. Lust, which is about mating and sexual behavior. Care, which is the adult counterpart of the panic. So the mother cares about the infant, and fathers as well, but especially mothers. And then there is this rough and tumble play, which is number 7 on the list. Very interesting. I don't have time to really get into this into more detail. And here is another important figure from Jaak Panksepp's most recent book. He talks about primary, secondary, and tertiary levels of processing of emotion. So primary level processing is this hardwired circuit in the brainstem and the diencephalon. So you have your 7 circuits, and they're all fed by these non-specific arousal. They're these neuromodulatory systems that I flashed on the screen half an hour ago, and then they kind of feed into these different pathways, and the brain kind of processes the same neurotransmitters in 7 distinct circuits, and of course they interact with each other. One thing I didn't mention, but there are these connections. Some emotional states tend to excite others, so panic can lead to seeking. So when the infant is afraid, it's separate from the mother, they start running around looking for the mother. So that is panic, kind of is positively affects seeking. Fear tends to enhance panic and vice versa and so forth. And then some kind of inhibit others. So there are relationship between these things. This is all primary level. So emotional affects, homeostatic effects, and sensory. So I don't have time to get into this. Then secondary is where learning kicks in. My next slide will be learning is very, very important. Emotions are permeated by learning through and through, because the world changes and different things are dangerous in different environments, and you cannot anticipate in advance what the dangerous things are. You have to learn these things as you go. And so the secondary and tertiary processes are all about learning. So secondary processes are implemented in the basal ganglia, and I have a slide about that. And then tertiary are up there in the neocortex. And all of this social constructivist business is in the neocortex. And Jaak Panksepp says, of course, yes, it does exist, but it is at the tertiary processing level. And there is more to the story than that. And now, to make a connection with something I talked about before, it is very speculative, but kind of very intriguing parallel. Remember when I told you that there are these 2 control circuits, one in the basal ganglia and another in the medial reticular formation? So they partition the nervous system into 3 sections, and these are like a 3-part partitioning, and the middle is precisely at the cut at the basal ganglia. And so something to think about. I'm thinking along those lines myself, but I'm not ready to talk about it yet. And now, this is a figure I really, really like, also by Jaak Panksepp. He says, look, early in development, things look one way, and then late in the adult system, the balance of forces changes, and it kind of flips on its head. So early on, it is the primary instinctual drivers that dominate. So a very newborn infant, very young infant, like 1 day old, most of what they have to go on are these instinctual drives, the primary process. And the drives are there just to make sure that the child stays alive and stays close to the mother. And then it naturally, and it's in learning mode all the time. And so it starts absorbing influences both from the physical world on the one hand and the social world from the other. And so this secondary processes is about learning, and then tertiary on top of that is even more learning, now mediated by symbolic language and concepts and high-level thoughts and so forth. So early on in development, the relative share is that there is a lot of instinctual behavior, a lot of crying and fussing. And then as the child grows up, this kind of shrinks, not because it goes away, but because the tertiary kind of expands so much that now if you rescale the figure so that it fits on the diagram, 80-90%, the bulk of the whole thing is now up in the cortex. And the original seed that kind of made the whole thing possible is now a relatively small part buried deep inside. Hence, you have to do archaeology of mind to get down to these things. And one good way to do archaeology is to study animals, because they don't have as much neocortex, and it's kind of closer to the surface to see what these instinctual behaviors, how they work in animals, and they're conserved. All mammals have them, and we are mammals, and so that's the plan. Now, I kept saying the all-important role of learning, so I have a slide about that. Everybody agrees that affective life is permeated by learning. Everybody agrees that the basal ganglia are heavily involved in learning, and that the neocortex is absolutely shaped by learning. And this cortical plasticity in particular enables societal and cultural influences. What is the issue of contention out there in affective science is whether the primary process emotions are instinctual, that is evolutionarily fixed, or not. Most affective neuroscientists working with animals tend to favor the biological view, whereas most social psychologists, and as far as I can tell, Kalina may disagree, neuroimagers favor the constructivist view. And if you all you do is kind of have images of cortex, and the cortex is constructed by learning, of course your data lead you to a constructivist view. Okay, now a very important example, fear conditioning. There is this enormous literature about that. One particular the most studied emotion is fear, and the most studied form of learning is fear conditioning. And so there is this rat minding its own business, and you have these unconditioned stimulus, electrical shock, which is painful, and pain is aversive, and there is this instinctual behavior like startle reflex. And so the whole learning begins by the fact that in order to get off the ground, there must be things that are not learned, that are there at birth. And the behaviorists call them unconditioned stimuli and unconditioned responses. So shock is just startling, painful, and that's how it is, and it is non-negotiable. That's where it all starts. And then if you pair shocks with light or shocks with sounds, then the animal starts jumping up when they see the light or when they hear the sound, even without a shock anymore. So it has become conditioned to that. And this is how you learn that in this particular environment, lights are actually scary. Okay, so that's a very prominent example. I see I have 10 minutes to go through these two bullets here. So let's see. Maybe the last one will have to wait until next time. We'll see. So the relation between emotion and cognition, affective science and cognitive science, actually, that's a very old kind of dialectic that has been going on in the Western culture. I don't know much about Eastern culture. It's a good bet it has been going on in Eastern cultures as well. Between reason on one hand and passion on the other. The two extreme poles of that are stoicism on one end and romanticism on the other. So yesterday, Kalina gave a quote from Seneca, a major Stoic. And so according to the Stoics, emotions are false judgments, and they are always destructive. The wise person cultivates a kind of state of disconnecting from the emotions. Emotions are bad advisors. Don't listen to emotions. Listen to reason. Philosophy is a kind of therapeutic tool to cure you from your disease of being too emotional. And the kind of goal is to achieve a state of apatheia, the lack of disturbances. Similar to Buddhism, by the way. They want to kind of get away from the cycle of suffering, samsara, and there are deep links between Stoicism and Buddhism. So this is the one pole. The other pole, romanticism, emotions are all there is. This is what we live for. And we want like storms and poetry and aesthetic experiences and love passions and Romeo and Juliet and all of that. This is the other view. And of course, there are all kinds of intermediate positions. And there you go. So in some sense, cognitive psychologists tended to be kind of near the Stoic side here, and affective scientists are on the other end. So that they're kind of in this binary opposition. If we translate this into the scientific realm, with all the caveats that it doesn't really fit, it's not a very good translation. But until recently, affective phenomena were studied by social, clinical, and health psychologists, but not so much by cognitive psychologists. Yes, cognitive people were engaged in emotion research, but always a kind of as one of variable that somehow affects the cognitive process of interest, such as memory, attention, and decision making. The most cognitive kind of mainline cognitive psychology, mainstream cognitive psychology gets to emotion is the distinction between what is called hot cognition, emotionally laden cognition, and cold cognition. Okay, and so for example, one prominent kind of partition, the dual process theory that many of you have heard, there is this system 1 and system 2. System 2 is the reasoning, high level, slow, deliberate, conscious part, but it is also logical. And then there's this intuitive system, and which is automatic, unconscious, and emotional. Or it may or may not be emotional, but if it is emotional, it is part of system 1. Okay, and now in Jaak Panksepp, he has a similar division. So affective type of consciousness versus cognitive. Affective is more subcortical, driven by neuromodulators such as dopamine and norepinephrine and acetylcholine, and it kind of comes in waves. These neuromodulatory systems kind of operate kind of waves of, and it overcomes you and then goes away. And cognitive consciousness is the other pole of that. And a major goal of psychotherapy is to promote cognitive control of affective processes. So when you have mental health issues, a lot of them are accompanied by this dysregulation of some emotional system or another. And another example would be cognitive behavioral therapy. And this is their standard kind of diagram. Their thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, and they mutually influence each other. And so sometimes you make therapeutic interventions by asking people to do things, to behave in a certain way. And sometimes they keep a diary and things, and they kind of think a certain way. And the hope is that by manipulating behaviors and thoughts, you can get indirectly influence the emotions and feelings, because feelings are very hard to kind of voluntarily modify. And the two scientists were in competition. I would make an appeal that this is kind of silly and we should join forces. But this is taken from one of the reviews by Joseph Ledoux, the fear conditioning guy, published in Annual Review of Neuroscience. So he says emotion research was a victim of the cognitive revolution. Cognitive in the 1960s. So the story was everybody was a victim of behaviorism, and then cognitive things came about, and kind of behaviorism was overcome, thank goodness. But now cognitive people took over, and for them everything is computation, and not everything is computation. So we are still kind of a victim of that. But according to Joseph Ledoux, cognitive questions seems more tractable than emotional ones, due in part to the dark cloud of subjectivity that hung over the topic of emotion. Although subjective experience and its relation to neuromechanisms is a potential difficulty for any area of psychology, cognitive scientists figured out how to study mental processing without having to solve the mind-body problem. So the mind-body problem is hard, And if you bang yourself against that wall, you're not going anywhere. So there is this, it kind of resonates with Adolph's and Anderson's decision to bracket out the conscious feeling so we can make progress. So emotion researchers, according to Joseph Ledoux, did not make this conceptual leap. They remained focused on the subjective emotional experience. So now, if you actually look at the brain, neuroimaging is a lot involved in that. That's a contribution of the neuroimaging literature. It turns out it is simply not possible to identify regions of the brain devoted exclusively to affect or exclusively to cognition. These things are interpenetrated, certainly at the level of the cortex. Maybe Jack Panksepp would say, in the lower brainstem, there is this circuit that is only about that. But certainly in the higher levels, everything is interpenetrated. So cognitive and affective processes are so tightly integrated at both cognitive and neural levels that it is impossible to separate them. Instead of cognitive, I should say mental here, or psychological. Otherwise, it's kind of chauvinistic. Okay, so it turned out I didn't manage to get to the last bullet, but it dovetails nicely. It kind of sets up the stage for next time. Next time, we'll talk about the meaning of life and the AGI alignment problem. And so I have 2 minutes for questions. Hopefully you will remain for another 5 or 10 minutes afterwards. I know there is this event at 6 p.m., but now it's only 5:58. So let's go on, and thank you for your attention. I'm eager to hear your questions if there are any.
Thank you very much, Alex.
Strangely enough, the chat is empty, or at least my chat is empty. Is that what you see as well? Maybe there are no questions.
I'll ask a question if no one else wants to ask a question.
Okay, go for it, Kalina. Thank you for staying.
So much.
Yes.
Thanks so much, Alex. This was great. And I actually have lots of questions, but I wanted to bring up that point first about, or at least for now, about the phenomenology, which is something that I've been really interested in, just subjective experience of phenomenology. And I've actually struggled from the research that I do in it being excluded from thought, right? So you presented how it's been excluded from emotions because of the problematicity of feelings, the perceived problematicity of feelings. And I similarly struggled how subjectivity is being excluded from thought, because for the most part, especially in Western science, people don't ask people about their thoughts. We just record reaction times and accuracy. And I wanted to ask you about that. Do you think it's specific to emotion, especially given that I've seen it in other places as well? And why do you think there's that fear of subjectivity?
Well, because it's hard to make scientific progress, I don't think there is fear, but a kind of pragmatic decision. There is this nut that is hard to crack, and there are these other nuts lying around, and you kind of try to crack as many nuts as you can, and some of them crack open and others don't, and you write textbooks and publish papers about what you can actually do. And so it is easier to study the easy problem of consciousness than the hard problem. So it is a reasonable research strategy to work on things that you can actually make progress about. And now the mistake, in my opinion, is when you try to define what you don't understand out of the question altogether and say, actually, emotions do not involve consciousness. So I study emotion. I don't tell you anything about consciousness because I have nothing to say other than what you already know from introspection yourself. But that's okay, because emotions don't involve consciousness by definition. So this is one way. I think it's kind of hypocritical. Of course, emotions are about feelings, but then we have this data that there was a reason. I then ran out of time. I couldn't develop it, but there was this experiment with the subliminal perception of the snake. And so you have this galvanic skin reaction, even though consciously you say, I didn't see anything. And so there are things to say in favor of the thesis that emotions are separate from conscious feelings about them. And so it is about where do you draw the line. With respect to cognitive side of this, as you know, there are now consciousness studies, and there are neural correlates of consciousness. And a lot of that is what is reportable versus what is not reportable. So there is a global workspace theory. There is a high-level thought, philosophical theory about emotion. So it is not that feelings and subjective experiences are completely banished from cognitive science, but until 10, 15 years ago, they were kind of avoided. And that is, I think, a legacy of behaviorism that we better get over with.
Thanks.
Does that help?
Yeah, we'll have to talk more about it. This is actually something that I'm working on. I actually think it is somewhat of a fear of subjectivity that we've inherited from somewhere or other. It could be from the Enlightenment and rationalism that still goes on.
Interesting.
Just, stay away from emotions. And I think as scientists, we carry that. So, because we could be studying subjectivity, we could just be asking people about their subjective states, but there's a fear of loss of control, of loss of experimental control, because now we have to rely on people's subjective reports as opposed to just measuring some kind of a biological or physiological measure. So it will be great to discuss that more. But thanks for this. Just bringing.
I will write you an email. Let's
yeah.
give. I see there is now something in the chat. I don't know if it's a question or not. It's actually addressed to you, Kalina. So, hi, Dr. Christoph. Really interesting to have heard you talk about the archaeology of mind and biological evolution in relation to affective science. Oh, sorry, I meant Dr. Petrov. So, thank you for talking about archaeology. As a linguist by training, I have come across a subfield called linguistic archaeology, which talks about how language evolved along with the evolution of the brain structure, and to a certain extent seems to connect language evolution with emotions. Within cognitive linguistics too, there is the embodiment hypothesis, which posits that conceptual language structure is grounded in our interactions with the environment, as well as emotions and our experience as human beings. There is also an emerging field within linguistics called affective neurolinguistics. So my question is, as you talked about the age of affectivism, do you think we are in the process of moving to a more effective approach to study of topics such as language away from a cognitive approach? Well, the paper, The Age of Affectivism, was published 2021, 3 years ago, and was an appeal, like a call for that. I don't think we are going past the age of affectivism. Actually, the appeal was, let's bring affective phenomena into the conversation. And in a way, this is what I'm doing with my lectures. I say, yes, let's talk about emotions. Now, my personal view is that they shouldn't be considered in opposition, like cognitive versus affective approach. We should have a mental science approach, which kind of includes both. And I realize now, until that my view that I held until a year ago, that cognitive science just includes emotions by default, is not what many other people think. There are people out there that make a distinction between cognition and affect. And so now, and I think that ship has already sailed. Cognitive scientists did have a chance to study emotions in the 60s when they were kind of riding the wave of excitement about the computers, but computers don't have affect, and so it kind of, the cognitive approach naturally gravitated towards learning and memory and perception and playing chess and those kinds of things, as opposed to social aspects like separation anxiety and all of that. Now, about cross-cultural linguistics and things, and embodiment hypothesis and all of that, evolution, in the putting it all together part of my talk that I didn't have time to get to, I explicitly talk about a co-evolution of the brain and culture together. In the human case, brains were shaped by the cultural environment. So one mechanism for biological evolution is known as niche construction. So instead of adapting to an existing niche, you make your own niche. And that's what humans have done. We kind of reshape the environment in a radical way. So now, if I look around, hardly anything of my surrounding is a kind of natural thing that you can find out in the wild. We make these houses, and we build fires, and we cook our food, and we speak language, and all of that is now part of the environment that the human child is brought into. And it has been like this for a few million years, and whatever selective pressures were shaping the genetics of that were now also shaped. For example, somebody who was more eloquent and could convince people had more chances of having children. And so this is how language can co-evolve with the changes in the brain. So things like that I will talk about next time in the beginning of the class. But I'm very sympathetic to these efforts. And talking about evolution doesn't have to be hostile to the fact that culture is absolutely important for humans, and the connection is that there is this cultural evolution and biocultural co-evolution. At least this is my preferred way of thinking about these issues. Okay, anybody from the faces and the little squares with names on them, if they want to ask a question? So Jenny, you seem to indicate. Or we can get Andrea Kulakov's question from the chat. So, okay, let's go. Hi, Andrea. Thanks for coming again. Emotions, so you wrote, emotions for sure play a role in cognitive, in quote, recognition as well. V.S. Ramachandran shows a problem that one patient had, namely not being able to recognize his parents. Yet, though through the phone, he recognizes his mother and father, no problem. It turned out that there is some problem in the emotional response that doesn't get activated by visual stimuli, even though it gets activated by the voice input. So there are parallel pathways, and only one was problematic in this case. Yes, thank you for bringing that up. This is absolutely fascinating. There are cases like this, and that shows that somehow you have this a part of the whole experience of meeting your mother or your loved one, your spouse, is that you have this emotional attachment to it. Certainly in the case of the mother was the single most important object in your universe when you were an infant, and it stays until throughout your life. Your mother is a very special person, and parents more generally, and so forth. So if you see your mother and there is not somehow something feels wrong about it, and then one hypothesis what went wrong is that this emotional coloring, affective coloring, is somehow damaged. It's not there. So there are patients who actually say, this is not my mother. This is an imposter. Somebody kidnapped my mother, and this is a robot that just looks like my mother, but it's not really my mother. I just can feel it's not my mother, even though on the surface it talks like my mother and looks exactly like my mother. It is not like my mother. And some people actually aggressively attack that imposter and that's a problem. So they can hurt their mother because they think it's an imposter. So something to think about. But thanks for bringing that up. That's a fascinating case, and I have read about them as well. Now, Ari, anybody from the video stream? Elena, I will leave it to you to interrupt me at some point. I will just keep going.
Maybe I would suggest one of the questions here is, which one was it? How does this relate, today's material, how does it relate to AI, AGI, SI?
Well, okay, so that will be the topic of next time, but...
Okay.
So to anticipate, the relation is kind of indirect, I admit, but overall the relation is, if there are these AGIs that are artificial general intelligences that are projected to become a lot more intelligent than we are, and so if we are not able, if we humans are not able to keep them in a cage, somehow forcing them to do what we want, if they break free and now it's up to them to decide what to do, the last hope is that they will decide to take care of us. And so now all of this business about the mother taking care of an infant, a helpless child, and kind of the mother reacts emotionally to the child, maybe this is something we should try to somehow engineer into these artificial systems, so that they naturally like humans, they protect humans, they feel towards us in the same way that we, shaped by biological evolution, feel with respect to young mammals in distress. When you see a crying baby, your instinct is just to hug it and comfort it. And it generalizes not just to human babies, but to monkeys and puppies and kittens and dogs. And in my particular case, speaking only for myself, I don't feel a lot about reptiles and frogs and even birds. I don't really have the same kind of visceral, emotional, compassionate attitude towards snakes for sure. Neither spiders, bugs, any of this. And so now, one connection is AGIs should feel towards us the same way we feel about human infants, and not how we feel about snakes and spiders. And so this is one connection. And if you want to put it inside the computer, it is certainly useful to know how it is implemented in the human case. And so what seems to be the case in the human is that there are these primary kind of unconditioned stimuli, and then the rest is learned. And so when we train these large language models, maybe we should put in some kind of basic emotional preferences from the get-go. So when the language model tries to predict the next word during learning, there are some words that feel good and other words that feel bad. So who knows? But it is, I think you would agree with me, there is a connection there. Now, Elena, okay. You have to stop
me.
Yes,
one last question here, and if you could answer in a couple of minutes, and then we'll take a break. This is a question by somebody from the audience here, Elena. Can you read it? It's in the chat. Shall I read it out?
You mean I or Elena will read it?
I will read it for her. She's far away. So she says, I want to discuss again the slide about the neuromodulators slide. That was about the different effects and properties of the different neurotransmitting networks. And my question is, do you think we need to look at the problem of emotion at biochemical level? Is that the deepest level that we can look at it?
Okay, thank you for the question. I think this is the slide that is being referred to.
They say yes.
My humanitarian friends recoil at the thought that emotion is reducible to neurochemistry. Although it is revealing that in English, at least, there is this, the word chemistry is used in a way like there is good chemistry So that means you really like the other person in some kind of unreflective, right out of the like love at first sight way. So I would think neuromodulation is absolutely part of this, a very important part, but it operates in the context of the entire brain, and the effect that these neuromodulators have is on neural networks throughout the brain. And so it matters what these networks are doing and what they have been trained on. And so neuromodulation is modulate the operation of the rest of the brain. And so everything is kind of one big interactive story, of which neuromodulator is one important component. But I would resist the implication that somehow neuromodulation is the root of everything. And although I am, as far as I know, one of the many dimensional theories of emotions. So remember, dimensional theories of emotions are that emotions are areas, regions in some multidimensional space or other. So according to one theory, it is a multidimensional space, and the axes of this space are dopamine activation, acetylcholine activation, norepinephrine activation, and serotonin activation. You have these 4 neurotransmitters, and they kind of, their relative degrees of activation define different points in this multidimensional space, and that somehow different emotions reside in different places of this space. And there may be some grain of truth to this, but again, it doesn't ring true to me. What rings true to me was much more along the lines of Jack Panksepp, and that's why I used his work as the basis of this lecture.